Welcome to Penn State Dickinson Law's Profiles in Leadership series. I'm Daryl Lim, the H. Lady Montag Junior Chair in Law and Associate Dean for Research and Strategic Partnerships. This series explores leadership through the eyes of judges, lawyers, policymakers, and institution builders as they reflect on their journeys, the institutions they have served, and the lessons they have learned along the way. It's an honor to welcome today's guest, Michael Aguinaldo, Chairman of the Philippine Competition Commission. Thank you for joining us. It's a privilege to welcome you to Profiles in Leadership.
Yeah, thank you, Daryl. It's an honor to be in your show.
Thank you very much. It's great to have you. Before turning to your professional life, may I begin at the beginning? Tell us about where you grew up and what aspects of your childhood and family life might have shaped your values and sense of public service.
Okay, I grew up in Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines. I was actually born into a fairly wealthy family. My grandfather was somewhat of a tycoon, at least the early part of his life. So I did my early years, it's quite privileged. But then the wealth started to dissipate for various reasons. And so while I did have really a privileged childhood, by the time I got to my teen years, some of the money had disappeared. And so we had to make certain adjustments. To give you an idea, when I was a kid, going to my during my elementary days, there would be days that I would be brought to school in a Cadillac, and being seen in a Cadillac was something that was quite unusual back then. Most of the vehicles were Japanese made. So seeing these big American vehicles, was something different. But just few years later, I started to take public transportation. And that's just to show how, our fortunes had actually fallen, which was actually good in shaping me because, for one, you already see early on differences between social strata. And you get to observe, how ordinary people or regular people go to work. You see how people behave. You see differences in wealth and the like. And so the nice thing about that is it makes you more self-aware and aware of your surroundings. Don't get me wrong, back then I kind of hated it. You get used to certain comforts, and so when it's taken away from you, it's not something good. But looking back, it helps really build on who you are. And so I think the exposure I had then had an impact on perhaps my view of social justice. Being able to, mix with ordinary people. I went to a private school. Um, so it carries with it a certain privilege. You're typically with mostly students on upper strata. And so seeing both sides, I guess that helps develop you one way or another.
Do you think it affected your schooling at all, this change in fortunes?
Yeah, because the school I went to, like I said, the private school, it's also a Catholic school. And so you do receive a lot of values education. Um, I'm not an outwardly religious person, by the way. I view faith as a personal thing, but when you take religion classes, every year, they kind of teach you values, and some of these, stick with you. And I think one of the things, or maybe the blessings of having, seen, the other side of life is you get a better appreciation of you get like a concrete example of what catechism is telling you. You actually see how the other side lives, and I think that's very important. Trying to see their perspective more than trying to see what their perspective might be from a higher vantage point, but seeing it from actually on ground level and seeing, okay, this is how they view things, this is how they live, etc., and so on. So I think that if you tie it on to say, governance and so on, that kind of leads you there. Because you see that life can be unfair, it may be unfair for other people. And, I know we do a lot to make who we are. But at the same time, there's luck that comes into the picture. There's opportunities, I mean, like I said, I was born wealthy, but then the wealth dissipated. But, we were still well off that my parents could afford to send me to private university. You know, a school is the cost of universities is not like the US. And in the US, most students are live with debt for decades after they leave. Here it's expensive, but not as expensive perhaps as universities in the US. But still, I was able to go to these universities, and so there, we were not too bad off, but you could say that we moved from a higher strata to a lower strata. But still, I
Nice.
wouldn't say that we were poor. And I wouldn't even begin to claim that I understand what it is to be poor. I can understand what it is not to have money in your pocket when you're going out, but, I cannot claim that I know what it's like to really be poor. I didn't live the life of someone who is poor.
Thanks. So many of our viewers will be in this part of the world, the United States. Um, Many of them will not have been to the Philippines, although most of them probably have heard of the Philippines. Please tell us a little bit about where you live and also about how it might have changed, the Philippines might have changed since your elementary school days to today.
Well, there's a lot of I mean, you could really say there's been progress from before. I think the Philippines has grown quite a bit over the last 50 years. There's still a lot of poor. There's a big gap between rich and poor, like other countries as well. And so Manila is like some kind of a paradox because you go around and you go certain areas, you see high rises and you see a business district and you see gigantic malls. I think we have two of the biggest malls in the world, so you see that kind of wealth there, but at the same time you look out your hotel window or an office window and you'll see shanties. You'll see an area where poor people live. So you have that mix. So is there development? Yes. But has it really reached down? I think there's been some improvement since over the last 50 years. But I think one of the problems really in the Philippines is, we can't get fully over the hump. You know, ideally you want to, become, I mean, at one point we were a tiger, and then I think we became a pussycat, and then we almost became a tiger again, and so on. And I could talk about all the reasons why, and I'll give you number one is politics, and probably bigger than that is corruption. But it's a funny thing because you see development, but also you see poverty. So you see both. There's a dichotomy there.
So one might say that might drive a person to become a philosopher. You decided to become, for at least the time, a philosopher. Tell us about that journey and what were some of your takeaways from philosophy?
Okay, it's sort of I wouldn't say it's accidental, but I think you like this story. Okay, I started out as an economics major. Okay, and I kind of enjoyed it, until finally we got to macroeconomics, and I was bombarded with all these graphs. And I decided then that I don't think I want to keep doing this. And so I said, okay, I'm going to shift. And initially I wanted to shift to psychology. But then I was informed that I still needed a prerequisite subject before I could major. And I was already tired of the general subjects and I wanted to major. And it just so happened that I had this professor who was so brilliant. She was teaching Western philosophy at the time. And at the same time, one of my best buds in my block um, was decided on taking philosophy as a prelude to taking up law. And a combination of those things and the fact that I wanted to major already, I said, okay, let's go with philosophy. I went up there. Ironically, that buddy of mine who took up philosophy didn't take up law. He took his ideas to the sky and he became a pilot. I, who wasn't intending to take up law, actually was, ended up taking law. But yeah, I guess the idea of philosophy, it's all about thinking. And it made you ponder about all these things. You get all these theories, points of view and so forth. And I think it did help me. It did help me quite a bit.
So you talked about Western philosophy, and I know Western philosophy has been very dominant in how we think about the world. Have you seen a rise of Asian philosophy or Filipino philosophy?
Mhm. Yeah, that's actually one of the things that we studied. That professor was talking about. She taught us as well, comparative philosophy, East and West. And so in the East, you have philosophy is generally tied to religion. So basically, you have Buddhism, and Hinduism, and you have Taoism. So, it's generally tied to that. And so some of those concepts, you end up trying to see, can they complement some of the Western concepts? And if you go back to ancient Greece, you'll actually find, the theory that, you know, some of Plato's later ideas seem to have some sort of Eastern or Asian influence, and the theory being that when Alexander expanded the Greek Empire, all the way to India, that obviously one of the first things that happened is trade, but trade in goods usually also accompanies trade in ideas, and so you know the body and soul concept, which is really in Asia, that's the Asian philosophies, that's really very basic. You see that later on in some of Plato's writings, some the difference between the two. So yeah, I think there is something there. Some ideas you try and mesh them and see whether they can work together. And I think that's probably the beauty of philosophy. You get to think about these ideas.
And the Philippines, in a sense, is also like a crossroads of trade and has been for many years. What would you say is the Philippine school of philosophy?
Oh, Philippines is funny because, we're in Asia, but who were our first colonizer was really the Spanish. So we had 330 plus years under Spain, and then we had about 50 years of being under the US. And so we have such a great influence from the West, and culturally, okay, one religion, predominantly Catholic Christian country, and credit that to Spain. And then um, the English language, so we grow up watching programs like Sesame Street, and they're in English. And so that's why a lot of people here speak English and they know programs in English and they know music in English. And so it's easy for them. One of the running jokes is, we were, 330 years in a convent under, the Spanish and 50 years in Hollywood with the Americans. That's kind of the running joke. So, so you do have that. Our religion is primarily a Western religion. But then, there is an Asian psyche to us. So we're kind of, I don't know, maybe kind of like bastards in that, we have both. We have that struggle between East and West, but it's not always a struggle. Sometimes it complements as well. And I think the key there, of course, is to find whatever way it can benefit you, whatever advantage you can get out of it. And I think that's the way of looking at it, rather than saying we should be more Easternly or Westernly. I think it's, taking advantage of the benefits of both.
What are some of the advantages you think of having had that history with Spain and more recently with America?
Um, well, I think there's quite a bit. While there are negative things, there's always positive things in some of these. With the Spanish, probably the concept of again the religion and so on. With the Americans, it's how you do things, how certain things are done, and so on. And so I think there were really benefits to both. There are negative things for on both sides, you know. At the end of the day, we were like a colony. We were subjugated under Spain. We were somewhat subjugated under the US. And so, no one wants to be, under another country. But then, again, there are benefits to it. There are things that we learned. There are certain disciplines that came out of it. Like I said, there are negative things, and you try and forget about that or get beyond that.
So then you decided you wanted to do law, and you went to Ateneo and you went to Michigan. So tell us about that journey and what were some of your takeaways during those years?
Oh, well, law school. So I graduated in philosophy with a degree in philosophy. And then the question was, what am I going to do next? And well, right before I graduated, I was given an offer to teach part-time in the Department of Philosophy. So, I said, well, I don't have anything anyway, so I might as well take it. So I took it. And then one of my best friends came back from the province, and he was really intent on going to law, and he was convincing me to go to law school. And I said, well, I have nothing better to do, so maybe I should try it. And so I ended up going to law school, and one of the things I like is, if I feel challenged, I like to take on the challenge. And so the first semester of law school was a challenge, and I did pretty okay. So I said, okay, might as well, continue on. At the same time, the group that I was with in the law school, we got along really well, and so it made it an enjoyable experience for me. And then, taking masters in Michigan, I think the prime reason there is, to get exposed to another country, live at least a year abroad and meet other people from different countries and so on and spend some time there. It was a great experience. I loved being part of the Big Ten, and I, I enjoyed the life on campus. I attended all the games, basketball, football, hockey. I went to concerts and so on. You do learn something. I mean, you're there to learn primarily, but the workload in when you pursue a master's degree isn't the same as when you're doing a JD. It's a lot lighter. I think we're required to take 12 units a semester. So, there's actually a lot of time to explore and learn more about the place that you're in.
So what did you
And
learn about America while you were here?
Oh, well, there were some things that you learn a lot from movies and television, and some of them actually you find out are true, like going to a college party where everyone is cramped in a small apartment, standing up, holding red plastic cups with beer or some other alcoholic drink, and so there's some things that are quite similar, but I think one of the things that I really liked was the diversity. I mean, you met all kinds of people. I'm not just talking about race or ethnicity. I just all kinds of people because even within the US, you come from the South or you come from the Southwest or you come from the East Coast and very different. And so that's one of the things I enjoy, trying to learn from all these people that you meet and so on. And some of them have remained friends up to this date. And so that's one of the things that I enjoyed. And then America is also the country of choice. You go to a supermarket, well, too much choice maybe, you know. So that's also something that you end up enjoying. It's a big consumer economy, and anything you need as a consumer, you can actually get. So, those are just some of the things, some of the observations, at least I made while over there.
What were some of the similarities and differences between your time at law school and reflecting on legal education in the Philippines compared to the US?
Well, the approaches are quite different. For one thing, I had some professors in Michigan that, would look at me as a guest rather than a student. you
That's a
know,
good thing, right?
Yeah, it's a good thing because they don't call you for recitation, and they even invite you sometimes to their faculty events where a faculty member might present a paper and they critique, and they invite you there to observe and watch. Maybe it was because I also had experience teaching law, so they probably that was one of it. At the same time, because we have somewhat different legal systems, there are some similarities. For example, our commercial laws are quite similar, and the commercial laws in the U.S., at least the federal laws, are more codal or based on like civil code concepts rather than common law. But then you do have the concept of common law, which is not really something we see. We're basically civil law, which is primarily because of the Spanish influence. So you get to see the difference in thought and so on. And you see, are there areas of reconciling this? The concept of equity comes to mind. You talk about equity in both civil law in terms of how judges might view things. And well, in American law, that's a typical concept. So it's good to be able to see like differences, similarities, and at the same time try and figure out, okay, certain things work in the US. Is it possible to work in a country like the Philippines? Or are there certain practices that we do in the Philippines that might actually be better or more suited to the Philippines than having something similar to that in America? So a basic difference, of course, is we don't have jury trials. Okay,
Do you want jury trials?
we don't have jury trials. It's just
But
a judge.
do you want jury
I don't
trials?
think so. I don't think we're mature enough to have jury trials as a populace. Um, we're easily swayed, or people here are easily swayed by what they hear on the radio or on TV, and more now with social media. So I think it's not something, it's not our tradition anyway. In the common law system, it's actually part of the tradition, right? So I don't think the only time we have a jury trial here is military tribunals. If it's an offense under military law, then they do have a sort of a trial, a jury system then.
Do you think there are aspects of Philippine legal system or culture that the rest of the world could learn from?
Oh, it's really hard to say. Something quite unique in what we do. I'd have to think more about that. It's not an easy question to answer because we tend to learn from other jurisdictions.
Mhm.
Is there something that we do peculiar that might help or might be good for others? I'm not so sure. I have to think about that a bit more.
Okay, we'll come back to that question later on,
Yeah.
which in the context of competition, which I'm sure is
Oh,
something that you've
okay.
been thinking a lot about. But before that, let's talk about your time in practice. So you were at Romulo Mabanta, and you
Yes.
became a partner. You became, in fact, part of the leadership team in the executive committee. Uh, Tell us about that journey and what those years taught you.
Well, the first thing you learn is that you only use about maybe 5% of what you learned in law school when you actually go to practice law. Because a huge aspect of what you do in practice is skills. You know, how to marshal facts, how to prepare a witness, how to strategize and anticipate questions, how to handle clients, how to speak to people. These are all things that you're not necessarily taught in law school. I mean, there might be, for example, an elective on negotiation skills, which is good. But again, it's a big difference from what you learn in the classroom, even if you do simulated exercises from the reality, actually doing it, and the basic difference, and I know this because I used to teach a class in negotiation skills, is that when you're doing it in the real world, it costs you something. There are real world consequences. Whereas you do it in the classroom, worst thing that's going to happen is you might not get that great a grade. But then you don't fully grade based on the results, but on the fact of participation. So it's very different. um, and so that's one of the things that you learn early on, and you have to figure out for yourself. You're lucky if you have some mentors who help you out, But I think a large part is you learning it, making mistakes, and then trying to figure out what you did wrong and how hopefully will not make the same mistake again. And then after that, you get exposed to the business side of things. Because and I used to tell this to young lawyers that come in, and even to my students, it's very easy to answer a question with yes or no, but that's not what the client wants to hear. If you say yes, the client might be happy. If you say no, the client's going to be unhappy. And, if he's not happy with the answer from you, he might ask someone else. But what the client really wants is, solution. I mean, yes, obviously there's things that are, strictly yes or no. Like, can I kill this guy? Obviously, you have to say no, right? But, in other things, what the client's looking for is some kind of solution. If I can't do it this way, can I do it that way? Not necessarily to evade, do tax evasion or so on, but within the rules, what might be a good approach,
Mhm.
to still get the same result. And so you kind of look at it from a business side as well. It's not enough that you tell them yes or no, you can do this. You have to also consider what impact those business decisions might have. For example, liability can be a strictly yes or no thing. But the other thing you might want to consider is what effect this might have on the reputation of the business, on the, how people might view that company. So there are all these other aspects that you have to try and understand where the client is coming from. And when I was doing corporate secretarial work, you listen to people discussing in the meeting of the board, and you're scratching your head because you hear some terms that you'd never heard before.
Mhm.
Like I remember the first time I heard EBITDA, I was like, "What the hell is EBITDA?" And so you slowly try and figure out these things, and then you realize, wait, I should at least have a basic knowledge of accounting, or at least I should know how to read a balance sheet. And back then, and when I say back then, it's like 30 years ago or so. Yeah, there was no YouTube or Wikipedia or or TikTok or anything that I could jump at. It's either you go to the library and get a book, but you don't have time to read an entire book. The next best thing is ask questions. You have an accountant in the office, you might ask them some questions and so on. Even members of the board, sometimes during a break, you might ask them a question, like, sir, what did you mean when you said this? Or what do you? And surprisingly, they actually enjoy educating you as well. And so these are things that you learn just by sitting and hopefully being able to ask. And I think at this time you also start to develop certain management skills. As you go higher in the organization, from junior associate to senior associate to partner, you get all these added responsibilities. So you're no longer just working on an account given to you by a partner. You might now have a junior associate working under you. And so you have to figure out how to handle him and how to make the most of his skills as well. So you start to develop some management skills along the way.
Yeah. And you have this extraordinary career which spans not just academia and private practice, but also right now public service. But there was a transition between private practice and public service. How did you make that transition and why did you make that transition?
Okay, so I was in private practice for almost 19 years, and I had been a partner for I think about 6 or 7 years. And I think I got to the point where I was getting a bit bored with the work. I was doing good work. I had regular stream of clients, and I was making decent money. But I think I started to get bored. And then one of my partners in the office, told me that the office of the president of the Philippines at that time,
And
they
this
were
was
looking.
Aquino.
Yeah, this was Noynoy Aquino, yes, was looking for a new deputy executive secretary for legal affairs. So the structure is you have the president, and you have the executive secretary under him. That's sort of like the chief of staff of the president in the US. Except I think the executive secretary might actually have more power. He's kind of like the little president, you know.
Mm.
Um, and so the deputy executive secretary would report to him. And so they have one for legal affairs, one for general governance, and so on and so forth. And so they said they're looking for someone. And he was suggesting that I try out for it. And I was saying, okay, it might be a good experience. You know, I've never been in public service. At the same time, I had a high respect for Noy Aquino. Not necessarily because I think he was a brilliant person, but he's a rarity in that he was someone who was really honest. You know, I mean, I don't think there's any president you could, put in his category of honesty. It was clean. I mean, ridiculously clean, you know. And so I said it might be a good time to go in public service. And so, and like I said, if I see a challenge that, I kind of say, okay, let's go for it. Let's try it out. And so eventually I was offered the job, and I said, okay, I'll take it. My boss, the name partner at the time, told me, no, that's good, but after 2 years, you should already cut. You should leave already and probably come back to the office. And I said, okay, probably would do that. And so, like I said, now it was a challenge because I entered that office, and the first thing I find out is there's no manual. There's no manual of operations, and my first day, I get this bunch of papers on my desk. And I'm thinking, what the hell am I supposed to do with these papers? And so the secretary, I mean, my executive assistant there, who was from there, I didn't bring anyone to the office, so I was relying on the career people, was explaining to me, sir, this paper, this is what you do. You endorse it to this office, and this one, you do this one. Oh, we have someone who handles that, and she'll come back to you with the results. Okay. So you find out that, okay, that's the value of having these career people there is that they know what to do. And so you try and learn from them first. And so it's funny because, coming from the outside, you had this very, um, pessimistic view of government and people in government. You think that, oh, they're incompetent, they're corrupt, you're gonna come in there and change things. So it's you coming in with a certain idealism, and you're actually met with a wall of realism in that, okay, yes, you have some great ideas, but it's not as simple as you think. There are a lot of rules in government, and at the same time, there are a lot of things that are done for reasons that maybe you did not realize at the time. And so at the start, you try and learn. You go by what they tell you. This is how you do. You try and think about it, but okay, let's see it that way. And after some time, and I'd give it, say, 6 months, you start now to rationalize. Okay, why do we still do this? Doesn't it make sense? And you never accept because that's the way we've always done it. No, 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 that's not the correct answer. There has to be a reason, and you have to give me a good reason. Otherwise, we should change it. My boss, then the executive secretary, said, we should limit signatures to a maximum of three. So you consider, when there's a piece of paper, how many people it goes to, and try and figure out, does that person add any value to it? If it doesn't add any value, then why does it have to go through that person? Then maybe we should rationalize. So you have to, come at it. Yes, you have some idealism. You think things should be done differently, but then you're faced with the reality. So you try and understand things first before you start trying to make changes. And that's actually what I did. When I left, we finally had the manual. That was one of the projects. And the whole idea of a manual is so that whoever comes in has, a document to look at. Can they change it? Sure. It's no longer within my control, but at least there's something that can benefit them.
Like, so let's talk about money in two aspects. One is you in fact had to take a pay cut, I imagine, moving from private sector to government. And so the first time you move from riches to poverty, shall we say, it was involuntary. The second time it was voluntary. Uh, and I'm sure a lot of good people who want to serve in public service, they say, well, I enjoy it. I can see it's noble, but I can't afford to take the pay cut. So talk to us about the kind of sacrifice and the thought that you had to wrestle with before you made that transition. But second, you were also involved in anti-corruption policies while you were there. And I'm sure, as in many places, it was a very difficult culture to change. So tell us about how you approached that issue and where you left things when you left.
Okay. Okay, first the money. Obviously, that was a major consideration before I accepted the job. And by that time, I had significant savings already put away. And so when my the name partner told me in 2 years, I said, okay, that seems like a reasonable period, to dissipate some of what I had saved. But the first surprise I got was that the pay wasn't as low as I thought it would be. Yeah, it was low, but it was probably twice what I thought it was. So I said, okay, at least it's not too bad, not good, but not bad. Okay. But then at that time, the government was embarking on a salary standardization program where they were actually raising salaries by a certain percentage for 4 consecutive years. So by the time I finished my fourth year, my salary had risen by about almost 50%. So,
That's a
it,
good
it was
raise.
getting better. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was still much lower than what I'd earn in the private sector, but it was getting better. At least I didn't have to dig into my savings anymore. Okay. Now, and that continued moving forward, so that and I can go into that later, but like the pay right now for someone in my position, it's not bad. It's pretty good, compared to the private sector. Um, Now, the second question, okay, part of my roles as Deputy Executive Secretary for Legal Affairs was handling the discipline office. And what this meant was for all presidential appointees except the judiciary, um, the president could impose disciplinary sanctions on them. And so the investigation and recommendations were done by my office. And so this could be um, a cabinet secretary, although we didn't encounter that, but it could be, lower government officers that are appointed by the president, could be assistant secretary, could be a director or so. And it also included local government officials. So governors, mayors, even though they're not presidential appointees, somehow we kind of had jurisdiction on that. And there's a process, and we do make the recommendation to the president. And I think one of the advantages of being in the office of the president is it's not easy to intimidate you, because you're working at the highest office in the land. So if they're going to intimidate you, well, they might as well intimidate the president, right? So it wasn't too difficult. There were some awkward moments because there's one case where we had to suspend someone, and I was close friends with the son, and but fortunately he understood. He said, well, it's a job that you have to do, and obviously they have to take whatever legal remedies they have. But fortunately, yes, I didn't really feel any pressure there. Now, one of the other things that I was handling there was I was in charge of the UN Convention Against Corruption. So I was in charge of the committee that was working on that, and so I did get some exposure on and in working with other anti-corruption agencies in the government.
So then you were part of the Commission on Audit as well. And auditing means you have to audit the executive. And you were saying just a few minutes ago, right? That, it's almost like you're trying to challenge the president. But in fact, that's what you had to do from time to time because you're supposed to audit the government. Uh, how how were you able to navigate that?
It's very interesting because, like I said, the original plan was, 2 years and then I go back to the private sector. But my boss, the executive secretary, was a great boss. He wasn't a micromanager. He gave us general instructions. He gave you a lot of leeway. But then he would school us as well. Again, being new to government, he would tell you, okay, do this, do that. Okay, don't take things too personally. Yes, you can be a crusader, but you can't let it affect you because you have a bigger job to do and sort of that. But so we enjoyed working with him and working with the other people around him. We made a pretty good team, I think, then that, we had decided, okay, let's finish it off. Let's take it out until the end of the term. So that was the whole idea. But then the office of the chair of the Commission on Audit became vacant. And I was reminding the executive secretary that we need to vet people for that post. And he told me to look for people, and I found some people, but apparently they weren't very interested. And a month before it was to become vacant, he asked me if I'd be interested. And I've never done audit other than legal due diligence. And I've never really dealt with the Commission on Audit. So I said, me? Why me? I mean, I don't know anything about audit. But then he told me, yeah, but you're there not as an expert, but as a manager. Okay. And this had a 7-year term. I said, wow, 7 years. It's like a major commitment. But then he said, well, if you're no longer happy, you can always quit. You can always resign. I said, okay. And so I said, okay, look, if you can't find anyone else, yeah, okay, I'll take it. And to be fair, he did try to find other people, but apparently the president already made up his mind and didn't want to revisit the issue anymore. And so that's how I landed there. And again, the challenge being, hey, I don't really know anything about audit. So first week on the job, I start reading the audit code and a lot of it didn't make sense to me. And so when you're faced with something like that, I think the thing that you need to do is, learn. You know, you can't pretend that you're smarter than they are, or at least than the people you work with in terms of audit, because obviously they know this more than you do. So what's very important is you try and you listen first and you learn. And so one of the things I did was I said to each department, okay, every week, each of you, you're going to spend 2 hours with me explaining one of the things that you do and some of the things that you do and some of the challenges that you face, and so that went on for about 3 months. And I think very important because um, these people, and we're talking about, assistant commissioners, they appreciated the fact that you actually wanted to learn from them because they were used to people coming in and just dictating things. Oh, this is how we do things and so on. But I was there trying to learn from them first before trying to make any changes to things. And so I think that was a big help. Again, after maybe a year, that's when you start to try and rationalize. Why are we doing it this way? Isn't it not economical? Why are we doing? You know, there's one instance where we were talking about a write-off of about $20. And being new, I was going with the flow, and the other two commissioners said, no, no, we can't do that because it was disallowed and so on. And then when the decision came and I was about to sign it, I said, this is ridiculous. We're signing a decision that's saying you can't write off this $20. It's not even a condonation, it's a write-off. It's just an accounting term. I think, and we're going to post this on our website, and they're going to see that we made the decision not allowing this write-off of $20, and it probably cost 10 times more that just to come out with this decision. It's ridiculous. So I ended up actually paying the $20 so that it's considered settled because I thought it would be embarrassing if we had this. And because of that, we came up with this rule that if the write-off is not more than $2,000, then the auditor on the ground has authority to do it. So you see, those are things that you try and rationalize as you learn as you move on. I wouldn't have been able to say that on my first day on the job. But 6, 8 months later, you know a bit better now. So let me stop there.
That's a good transition to where you are now, which
Oh,
is the
okay.
Philippine Competition Commission. You, despite your role as auditor, and that's sort of an antagonistic job by design from the government, they obviously liked what you did because they invited you to become the chairperson of the commission. So tell us about that journey.
Yeah, okay. Well, before that, I forgot to address the other thing you mentioned,
Sure.
the thing about pressure. Yeah, it's really a thing there because you're auditing the entire government, and you're auditing expenditures, and if they did anything wrong, and it's seen on documentation. I mean, it's fact finding. So hey, this is what the evidence shows. Um, as I learned, through the 7 years of the Commission on Audit, it's a question of handling. You do have a job to do, and you have people who are there to do that job. Bottom line, I said, if the findings are supported by the evidence, I mean, it is what it is. That said, there's also the manner by which the findings are presented. So ordinarily, there might be an audit report or there might be a decision. It could be one of those. And it's published on the website, and the media knows it's there and they have access to it and said, that's enough. There's no need to hold a press conference. And your sole purpose would really be, it would seem, to embarrass someone. No need to do that. Anyway, media will get it. They will bring it out there. They will try to defend themselves. And I said, let's not answer. Because who does the public believe more? And at that time, definitely they believed us more than any politician or any legislator who was trying to say the thing. And so, but at the same time, even though we're an independent agency, the concept of interdependence in government is something people don't talk about enough. Yes, you're independent in the way you decide things, but you're not fully independent. You have to get your budget. You have, to deal with other government agencies. And so, what I always said was, we're not trying to shield anyone out. We're not going to freeze anyone out. We're willing to engage with other agencies and work with them in case, a congressman, a governor, or a cabinet secretary wants to meet to discuss a problem that he has, maybe a personal thing regarding expenditures. I said, it's fine. Our door is open. You can meet with us. And I literally mean my door is open so people outside the room can hear what's going on, you know. Um, but the bottom line is, if I meet with any of those people, I will not make any promise other than that we will study the issue carefully. That's it. I will not promise an outcome. I will just say that we will study it. More often than not, they were very happy with that because I guess it has some sort of cathartic effect being able to, you know, bring it out. But, sometimes maybe they were convincing enough in their arguments, but a lot of times not enough. And, sometimes I'll just send them a message, I'm sorry, but this is the decision that was made. Anyway, there is an appeal process. So, they could always make do with that. And generally, it's been not a problem. The fact that, I informed them and so on, it seems that they respect that at least quite a bit, even if they're not happy with the outcome. Now, how did I get to competition? So my term ended, it's 7 years. And one of the nice things about completing that 7 years is it gives me with a pension. Okay, so you go through all that stress and then, at least you have something at the end of the day. And so technically, I was in a situation where, when you're young, you're dreaming about not having to work anymore and yet earning. And so I said, okay, I'm almost at that point. And so I wasn't doing anything for the year. I became one of the bar examiners. So that's the only thing I did for a year. And then I get a call from our economic minister. He was previously the chair of the Philippine Competition Commission. He was the first chair. And he told me, hey, look, my term is ending in January. And this was around October. And there's one of the commissioners is currently the officer in charge. I told the president not to appoint anyone yet because whoever he appoints would be serving only until January, so it doesn't make sense. Would you be interested? And my first question is, what exactly do you do there? You know, and just to give context to your viewers, Competition law is very new. We did not have an antitrust law in the Philippines until 2015. And in fact, when I went to Michigan, I didn't study antitrust because we didn't have an antitrust law. So why would I study it, right? Anyway, so and then I asked him, Mr. Secretary, why do you think of me? And he said, well, two things. The way I've known you from, the last 10 years is that you're not beholden to any of the oligarchs. And I said, yeah, that's true. I know some of them, but I've never really worked for any of them. Okay. And secondly, he said, I looked at your CV, and when you went to Michigan, you took up your master's, and you had a special concentration in international economic law. But then I said, yeah, but what I studied there was the WTO. I didn't study antitrust because we didn't have any antitrust law, and they said it was kind of technical. So I said, why am I going to give myself a hard time, for something that I might not be able to use? But then he said, it's the important thing is they see the word economics there. So that should be fine. And so I told him, okay, it sounds interesting. I'm open to it. And he said, okay, I'll recommend it to the president. And 2 months later, I got appointed to
So,
the
why
post.
did the Philippines enact a competition law in 2015?
Oh, okay. That was like 20 so years in the making. There was really a push. And I think because ASEAN countries were already getting, I think almost about five or six of them already had a competition law by then. We are also being pushed by like the EU, and I think they may have, negotiated it, tied it to some, system of preferences with respect to trade tariffs and so on. So finally, it got there. And I mean, there were snippets in other laws. Our Constitution talks about, restraint of trade and monopoly combinations and monopolies and the like. We had something in our penal code about it, but there was no, really antitrust law. There were just parts here and there, so finally, they came out with it, and so that
Where
leads
did
us
they
to
look to? Did they look to Europe for their model code?
it's a combination. Our anti-competitive agreements is primarily based on U.S. law. The abuse of dominance and merger control is primarily
Hmm.
EU law. Yeah, so it's a combination actually.
So once again, the Philippines takes the best of different places and puts it together to have its own model.
Well, I hope it's the best of different places. Yeah, we try and fix it together. And at the same time, we continue to learn. We try and see, how things are working out. I mean, even in the US, rule of reason is becoming more and more something pronounced, even for
Mm,
what would normally be per se violations. What we've tried to do so far is if it's a per se violation, we apply the rule of reason in determining what penalty to impose. Even if it's an anti-competitive agreement, if it had no effect on the market, then, why come down with a punitive penalty if
yeah,
there's no real effect?
yeah. We're coming up to the hour, but I'm just starting on perhaps the most exciting chapter of your career. With your permission, is that all right if we go another 10, 15 minutes?
It's no problem.
So let's talk about your priorities when you became chair. What did you decide that you wanted to focus on?
Okay, again, I'm back to that situation where I enter something and most of the people there know more than I do. And so the first thing I have to do, of course, is learn. Now, it helps that the other commissioners I know personally. And in fact, one of them is a very good friend of my wife, and I have known her in the past and worked with her in the past, actually. And so, and some of those who came in with me, and when I say came in with me, because we have five positions in the commission, there's the chair and four commissioners. And two commissioners were initially appointed for 5 years only. So we're kind of staggered. And so when I came in, there were two other commissioners with me, and I actually knew both of them. So, it became a bit easy because at least there's already relationships between us. We know each other. And so the first thing I have to do is again learn. And so, I had to, take a crash course on competition. I had to do 36 hours of videos of I don't know if you've heard of Crese, that antitrust seminar that they do in Greece every summer. For they have economics for lawyers, law for economists, and then the executive program, which is like a 5 or 6 day crash course. So I did that on video, some were enjoyable, when you hear Bill Kovacic or Fred Jenny discussing, those are really things you learn from. And then you have the deep economists talking with all the graphs and all. So those were like hair-pulling moments. And but then, you have to at least, learn what's going on, basics and so on. And the same thing. But immediate priority obviously was capacity building
Mm.
because it's new and we needed to build capabilities. Now we have a lot of good young people. We have all these Latin honor economists, and we have all these young idealistic lawyers and all, and it's very good, and I encourage them. At the same time, one of the things that I saw immediately were lacking was the business point of view. Looking at things from a business aspect, which again is very different from looking at things from purely economic aspect. They don't necessarily jive all the time. And so that was one, capacity building. Fortunately, we had resources and program to actually do that and continue to do that up to today. And then advocacy, because very few people know what competition is in the Philippines. And when you say Philippine Competition Commission, and I kid you not, a lot of responses I've gotten were, "Oh, is that about sports?" So when you say competition here, what comes to mind is sports or maybe a beauty pageant, but not antitrust. So that concept was something not there. So you couldn't really talk about a culture of competition in terms of, fair business and so on. So that's something that from the start they were trying to build. We used to do surveys of the general public, but we were hardly moving the needle despite our presence in social media and the like. Now, I've always, well, I don't say I've always, but I've learned to actually say that your best advocacy is really a good case. Unfortunately, we haven't really gotten that to that stage. We do have one big case that we've decided already it should come out in a couple of months, so maybe that might be it. But then we realized, okay, we should focus on something else since obviously no one wants to read about competition law in Instagram or TikTok or so, right? I mean, you'd rather look at a lot of other things like food or places to visit or sports or so on. So I said, let's continue our presence there, but then let's focus more on things where we may have an impact on the public. So, for example, enforcement cases that might directly affect them, be it price fixing in water refilling stations or in driving schools or scuba diving services in a resort area, um, and then try and get, our enforcement office likes to, monitor social media, and they see people complaining about the lack of choices in some malls and so on. So, okay, let's see if there's something that we can do there. Um, Reaching out to local governments, state universities, private universities, explaining what competition law is and trying to sort of like train the trainers, at least have champions of that in there. And we do that as well with some of the local business associations, trying to explain to them the benefits of competition. So that's something that we're quite active in, trying to expose ourselves more on what we do and how we can benefit others. One of the more interesting things that we were able to achieve was there was a complaint on social media about I mentioned the mall earlier, but there's the biggest retailer here. They operate about 90 malls in the country, and there was a complaint about the bottled water that you could purchase from the food carts. We're just talking about food carts, okay? Not even the food court, but just food carts. And it was only one brand of bottled water, and it was manufactured by the mall operator. And so our enforcement office investigated, and they actually said it appears there's no written policy, but the impression of the food carts is that they had to get that water there, but they weren't too bothered by it. But surprise, surprise, the mall operator offered to settle. So we said, oh, it's surprising, for something quite small, they're offering to settle. And part of the settlement really was, no, you have the obvious, which is they would hold competition law seminars for their employees, for all their tenants. And so you're talking about, almost 90 malls. So that's quite a bit. So I said, okay, that's a pretty penny that they're going to be spending. And then help us in advocacy. They have all these LED screens in the malls. They would give us like some time to put some stuff there. And one of the clinchers, though, was they also operate movie houses. And so you're looking at maybe about 1,000 movie houses all over the country. And so they agreed to provide us with three 30-second slots. When you watch a movie, you normally go there early to see the trailers, of what's coming. And sometimes there's some public service announcements that are shown at that time. So they said, we'll give you every day three 30-second slots. And we did have advocacy videos that was part of our campaign. And so we just had to reshoot a few of them, to fit the audience. And so that went on for a year. So we were having our videos shown every time they had trailers. And to be fair to the mall operator, they didn't just do it 3 times a day. Every time they had the trailers on, it would come out. So maybe 5 or 6 times a day. And they did that for a year, every day in all their malls. So, this was a great advocacy tool because people would come up to us and say, oh, I saw your ad. You had this ad about price fixing. You had this ad about bid rigging and so on. And the funny thing is the year ended last January, and up to today, you go to a movie house, you actually see it. And so we asked them to, there's a question, should we ask them to pay some kind of settlement fee or fine? And I said, well, let's ask them first how much all of this is going to cost them, the seminars, the movie slots, and so on. And they gave a figure of about $8 million. And of course, my thought is, well, obviously, that's not the actual cost of it. It might be opportunity cost or so. So I said, half it, $4 million, not bad for, a small case involving bottled water. I said, even a tenth of that, $800,000, not bad. So, and the funny thing is, there's the second big or the third biggest small operator is now working on a similar settlement with us. So, you get some of those things on
That's
the
a great
side.
out of thinking out of the box. And
Yeah.
and they started on the other side and they became your partner in competition advocacy.
Yeah, in fact, there was when that, because we did have a signing ceremony and it was on Facebook and there was a comment there, really they're partnering with this group, they're the biggest retailer and so on. And someone made a comment, could it be a case of keeping your enemies closer? But partly it is because they're supposed to have a competition compliance officer.
Mhm.
And the idea there is that if there's any complaint, before it becomes, a full-blown case, we give it to that officer to see if they can resolve it. If they can resolve it in-house and it's done, then good.
And I don't think I've heard other competition authorities being as creative in working with their, shall we say, potential defendants in finding creative solutions like this. So one of the things that I was thinking about is what could, as we discussed earlier, what could the Philippines teach the rest of the world? And that might well be one shining example.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, we've learned from other jurisdictions in Asia as well, like Hong Kong does all these short videos.
Mhm.
You can see them on YouTube, which are really well made, and they talk about anything from, retail resale price maintenance or so on, and they give specific examples that actually resonate. Like I remember seeing one that involved uh, toy robots. It's a sort of big thing in Asia and in Hong Kong in particular. And there they were talking about resale price maintenance. So there was an entire skit, and there was even a love angle included there. So it's like, oh, very interesting. Thailand, one of their commissioners composed a song and recorded the music video about competition. So, okay, that's not something you see every day and so on. So yeah, there are things that you get to pick up from other jurisdictions, and hopefully they get to pick up some of our ideas as well.
So how do you resist the pressure uh, for businesses to slip money under the table to
Mhm.
competition officials because there's a lot at stake, and in your former role, you have a front row seat to how
Mhm.
corruption works institutionally. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. Okay. One of the things we're lucky to have is a very young and idealistic workforce.
Mm.
So, at that level, there are a whole lot of young people, very idealistic, and they work as teams. So
Mm.
it becomes a little more difficult to penetrate that. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible. It could be, but I think they're pretty much there. Our organization pretty young. We only have two people who are above 60. Everyone else is younger. I'm joining that group in a couple of years. So, um, at the same time, the fact that we're a collegiate body, I think it makes it a bit more difficult because you have to get three out of the five. And at the same time, you're driven primarily by what our economists might find in terms of mergers, in terms of, what the harm is or potential harm is. And so you'd really have to make a good case why you are going to overlook something like that. I mean, it's possible there might be some overriding reason. For example, it's an industry where you don't expect much investment, and so you think, okay, maybe this is something we should allow. But more often than not, it's actually quite difficult to do it. For enforcement, conceivably, you could have a bigger chance there. But so far, we haven't seen anything of that sort. Again, not to say that it can't happen. The thing is, again, keeping our eyes open and, studying each case meticulously to see whether, why are you recommending this and not that and so on. Um, the people in the agency are relatively well paid than most other government agencies, although we haven't had an adjustment in quite a while, and so other agencies are catching up. Hopefully, we get that. I think that might be one incentive, or at least one reason not to do that. But again, a lot of it is vigilance and trying to find out. I think we're hiring a retired police officer soon, so he might be able to provide us with better intelligence on ongoings. But generally, we do have a very young and idealistic workforce, and I hope they remain that way.
So the other source of pressure is uh, the politicians, the government. They may have their own agenda, as we have seen here in the United States. That's not consistent with economic analysis. So, have you experienced then? What's been your response to that?
Yeah. We haven't really had any direct pressure from politicians. And I think part of the reason is, here in the Philippines, we're not divided into ideologies. There's no like Republican, Democrat, there's no clear liberal and conservative. I think most people are sort of either, centrist or right of, slightly right of center or left of center. You do have some extremists, but maybe more on the left side, you have, certain socialists maybe or left leaning. And so we haven't really had that pressure. Sometimes they ask us, or, oh, why haven't you done this? Or why did you allow this? And we just explain, that this is the analysis there. This is the reason why we did so. And again, part of it is handling, if there are any concerns outright. We have a legislative liaison officer who tries and explain to them what happened. But we've been lucky, I guess, that we haven't had that kind of pressure so far. Hopefully we
So,
don't get it.
how long is your term as chair for?
It's also a 7-year term. I'm supposed to step down in January of 2030.
What do you want to do between now and then?
Continue our capacity building efforts. Hopefully, heighten our reach in terms of advocacy. Um, again, quality of the decisions that we come out with. Hopefully, we get better and enforcement cases. I mean, one of the challenges is really evidence. Despite the fact that the quantum of proof required is just substantial evidence, still coming up with evidence is quite difficult. We do have a leniency program, but we don't have anything that will entice informants or whistleblowers. We can't offer them anything, you know. I mean, if you're an employee of a company that's engaged in price fixing, I mean, it might not be you who's going to be liable in any event. But then what incentive do you have to actually spill the beans and say, yeah, yeah, you know, here I have a bunch of emails you can check. They made some sort of agreement. So that's something we're working on. And if ever a law gets amended, that's something I want to put in there, you know, that we could provide maybe some kind of rewards or, you know, for
Mm.
informants and so on. Um,
So not just leniency or immunity, but actually financial incentives.
Yeah, you know, because otherwise there's no incentive. Of course, if you're looking at possible liability, then that is incentive enough, I guess, for most. But
How would you peg the right amount of reward?
we probably have to see how they're doing it with agencies that do have you know, funding for rewards and try and benchmark. We'd probably look at, you know, if there are other jurisdictions that might do the same thing and kind of, you know, see well how much would they give for something like that. I really wouldn't be able to say at this point, but definitely we need some kind of incentive for whistleblowers who don't aren't exposed to liability as you know, as a principal in in anti-competitive agreements or abuse of dominance or so.
Any chance that you might want to be renewed after your
I
first
cannot.
service?
It's single appointment, that's it.
So what would you want to do after that?
I don't know. I don't know really. I guess I've gotten to the point where, you know, I get to choose what I want. I mean, if I don't like something offered to me, then, you know, I just decline it. And I have had a couple of offers while I was here, and I declined them for various reasons. I'm You know, I enjoy the work that I'm doing now because I'm learning so much. Not just, you know, in the office, but, you know, in all these international engagements. I mean, it's easy to talk to people involved in antitrust, you know, because you speak the same language. And apparently some of the issues that we encounter, you know, have been encountered by others before. So, you know, you're able to get the benefit of their wisdom and their experience.
Well, thank you for this very generous and thoughtful conversation. I think there's a lot there that people can learn both institutionally as well as personally from you. And certainly people have now have an additional reason to look at the Philippines and what's going on there. So thank you for joining us for this episode of Profiles in Leadership.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, Daryl. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.